The envelope never came. No gold-trimmed card, no formal letter, not even a casual text. I found out about the gala from a neighbor, Mrs. Lorne, who'd once asked me to fix her front gate. She waved the flyer at me excitedly. "Your son's hosting this?" "Oh, Robert, what a proud moment." She smiled wide, unaware her words bruised deeper than she could imagine. I stared at the flyer longer than I should have. The Horizon. Gala. A celebration of modern brilliance. Beneath the title, in bold letters, was my son's name. Ethan Hart, Chief Curator. He hadn't mentioned it to me. Not once. No call. No email. And now it was 2 nights away. That evening I called him. His voice was calm, controlled, the kind he used when speaking to sponsors or press. "Hey, Dad?" I cleared my throat. "Saw the flyer. Big night coming up, huh?" A pause. "Then yeah, it's kind of a major launch for the new wing. Tons of people. Press, sponsors, high-level crowd, you know." I knew. I also knew where this was going. So I said gently, "Am I supposed to bring a tie, or is it black tie only?" Another pause. Longer this time. He sighed. "Dad, I just don't think it's really your kind of scene. You wouldn't enjoy it. The noise, the crowd. It's not really your thing. Not really your thing." I sat back in my chair, the one Eliza had chosen before her passing. Warm, creaky, and still bearing faint threads of her favorite shawl. He continued talking, something about logistics and security, but I'd stopped listening. Because behind those soft words, the meaning was loud and sharp. "You don't belong." I let him finish, then said, "All right, I understand." And I did. I understood that somewhere between gallery walls and champagne receptions, I had become someone he needed to hide. Someone too simple, too out of place. A memory that didn't match the aesthetic. When we hung up, I didn't feel angry. Just still. I walked down to the basement that night, the one room in the house he never cared to enter. It still smelled of cedar and dust, a gallery of forgotten things. On the far wall hung a piece Eliza adored, a sketch of a mother and child, done in soft charcoal, no signature. I stood in front of it for a long time. The lines were imperfect, smudged, the paper yellowed. But I saw us in it, her hand over mine, my hand holding Ethan's. And as the wind rustled faintly through the cracked basement window, I whispered, "Not really your thing?" The words echoed, and something inside me, quiet, long ignored, began to stir. Friends, let me take a short pause. If you're listening to this story right now, would you mind sharing in the comments where you're watching from? Have you ever experienced something similar? A moment when someone you loved made you feel like you didn't belong? Your stories matter. And by liking this video, subscribing, and sharing it with someone who needs it, you help us grow this channel and keep telling the stories that speak to the heart. Now, let's continue. It was a week after the gala. I hadn't asked how it went, and Ethan hadn't offered to tell me. Silence like dust had settled between us. Thick, familiar. But curiosity has a way of disguising itself as coincidence. I'd gone to the gallery unannounced, just to see the new exhibit before the rush of tourists dulled its colors. I walked the marble floors slowly, shoes echoing in that calculated quiet, the kind designed to make people whisper and feel smaller than the art. I recognized none of the pieces. Abstract forms, stark lines, metal twisted into shapes that screamed of anger or maybe just emptiness. People stood around murmuring words like visceral, meta-real, or post-anguish. I stood in front of a canvas that looked like spilled oil on pavement. No title, no signature, just a small plaque, untitled, 2024. I was about to move on when I heard them. 2 young curators talking near the entrance, unaware I was around the corner. "That's Ethan's dad, right? The one who thinks dogs playing poker belongs in a museum?" They laughed, the kind of laugh that doesn't come from humor, but from hierarchy. "Yeah," the other said. "No wonder he stays away. Guy probably thinks Thomas Kincaid was a genius." More laughter, louder. I froze, not because of what they said, but because of what followed. Silence. The kind of silence that should have been filled with correction, or defense, or even just discomfort. But then I heard it, the soft clink of a wine glass, Ethan's voice, smooth and measured, talking to someone else as if nothing had happened, as if their words didn't scratch bone. He didn't defend me. He didn't say, "That man taught me to see beauty in things before I could walk." He didn't say, "He sacrificed so I could stand in this gallery at all." He didn't say anything. I left quietly, unseen, though I'm sure they wouldn't have recognized me anyway. I walked home through streets glowing with early evening light, watching people laugh in cafes, dogs tugging at leashes, children pointing at clouds, and all I could think about was Eliza. She used to say that art was what made the soul visible, that the truest pieces don't ask to be understood. They simply wait to be felt. I remembered the way she'd place old paintings beside fresh flowers. She believed beauty should live in corners and kitchens, not just behind velvet ropes. That night, I sat in the basement again, surrounded by frames wrapped in canvas and memories. One sketch, a crayon drawing by Ethan at age 6, still sat above her writing desk. A stick figure family, under a sky of crooked stars. She framed it like it was Monet, because to her love was art, but to them, to him, love was kitsch. Sentiment was embarrassing, and history? History was only sacred if someone famous had signed it. I ran my hand over the wood of the chair she once sat in, and I knew, without needing to say it out loud, they had their world, and I had mine. Only difference was, mine still had meaning. The basement was never meant to be a gallery. It didn't have polished floors or track lighting. There were no labels beneath the paintings, no hushed docents rehearsing curated narratives. Just concrete walls, an old bulb that flickered when the rain came, and a long wooden bench that creaked when you sat too hard. But it was hers, and it became mine the moment the world upstairs stopped making sense. Eliza used to say that some art whispers instead of shouting, and those were always her favorite pieces. Not the ones that demanded attention, but the ones that waited to be noticed. A brushstroke here, a smudged shadow there. Details so fragile you had to lean in close, breathe softly, and just be with them. We never had much money when we started collecting. She was a school teacher. I laid bricks. But once a month we'd drive out to estate sales, second-hand bookstores, forgotten antique shops on the edge of town. She had an eye, not for value, but for feeling. She could see a cracked watercolor pinned behind old postcards and gasp like it was treasure, and to her it always was. She never cared about names, only stories. She'd hold up a sketch of a nameless woman on a park bench and whisper, "Someone missed her. That's why this exists." That was enough for her. That was enough for me. Over the years, we filled the basement slowly, never rushed. Each piece found us somehow. A boy holding a paper boat in the rain, a blind violinist drawn in pale graphite, a single oil painting of hands, just hands, reaching but never touching. None of it was trendy. None of it was signed. But all of it was alive. After she passed, I kept coming down here. Every week, I'd dust each frame, rearrange a few, sometimes just sit and remember the way she used to hum when she found something she loved. I could still hear it in the silence. These pieces weren't decorations. They weren't investments. They were echoes of her taste, her tenderness, her belief that art was never meant to impress, only to connect. Ethan never stepped foot in that basement after she died. I think part of him couldn't bear it. Or maybe he never really understood what we were building down there. Not a collection, not even a shrine, but a conversation. One that began when we first held hands in a thrift shop and continued through decades of dinners, late-night unpacking, and coffee-stained catalogs she marked with stars. People talk about legacy as something grand, buildings with your name on them, endowments, headlines, but Eliza knew better. She once told me, "Legacy is what you leave in people's quietest moments," and in the quiet of that basement, surrounded by all she'd gathered and cherished, I felt her more present than in any photograph. This room, with its chipped walls and unframed beauty, held the kind of wealth no museum could price. It wasn't meant for crowds. It wasn't meant for applause. It was meant for the two of us, and now it was all I had left. It had been gathering dust behind the shelf for years, one of Eliza's dearest finds, a war-era pencil sketch, delicate and aching, done on the back of a ration envelope. The lines were rough, yes, but purposeful. A young soldier had drawn it during a lull between gunfire, somewhere foreign and gray. You could still see the indent of the envelope's fold, splitting the image through the middle. On one side, a church in ruins. On the other, a boy, maybe no older than 16, asleep against a stone wall, cradling a notebook like a prayer. Eliza had cried when she found it, not because it was sad, but because it was human. She used to say the sketch didn't just show a moment, it preserved a soul. He didn't have time to be a master, but he had something more urgent: honesty. That day I had taken it out of its old glass sleeve, cleaned it gently, and brought it upstairs. Ethan had stopped by unexpectedly, something about wanting to borrow a rare book from the office. I'd hoped maybe, just maybe, we could sit for a while, share a memory, even one. I held out the sketch, careful not to smudge the edges. "Your mother always believed this was one of the purest pieces we ever found," I said softly, almost a whisper. He took it with 2 fingers, glanced down for less than 3 seconds, and shrugged. "It's crude," he said, handing it back like it was junk mail. "No technique. You need to stop clinging to nostalgia, Dad. That's not art, it's sentiment." There was no malice in his voice. That almost made it worse. It wasn't a cut. It was dismissal. The casual kind. The kind that comes from someone who has already decided what deserves value and what doesn't. I didn't argue. I didn't tell him how Eliza had sat on the basement steps that night, holding this piece to her chest, how she had wondered aloud if the soldier ever made it home. I didn't say how we'd promised each other that forgotten hands like his deserved to be remembered, even if the world never applauded them. I simply placed the sketch back in its folder and slid it into the drawer. Because when your own child stops looking, not just with his eyes, but with his heart, words lose their shape. They fall like dust in rooms that used to echo with warmth. After he left, I stood at the window watching him drive away. He looked so polished now, confident, important. His car gleamed like the life he had built, precise and untouchable. And yet somehow the space he left behind felt colder than winter. I walked back downstairs. The basement welcomed me the way it always did, with creaks and shadows and color that only bloomed in silence. I hung the sketch back on its nail. Not straight. Eliza never liked them perfect. She used to say, "Let the soul of it tilt." And I sat there across from that soldier boy, his head resting on hope. He didn't need a name to matter. He didn't need perfection to endure. But for the first time, I wondered if my son would ever see him again. Not on a wall, but truly see him. Or had the price of prestige already stolen his eyes? The pencil line stared back at me. And in that silence, where Eliza once hummed and the world above no longer reached, I made a quiet promise. If my son no longer remembered what art was, then maybe it was up to me to help the world remember instead. It was supposed to be a small visit, just a quiet stop, no announcements, no expectations. He had mentioned the gallery expansion in passing months ago, and on a chilly Tuesday morning, I found myself standing at the glass doors of his world, watching reflections move like ghosts across the polished floor inside. Everything about it was clean, sharp, intentional, the kind of space that hummed with importance. White walls, stark lighting, people in black turtlenecks discussing form and space with serious eyes and shallow voices. I didn't belong there, but I came anyway, not to make a statement, but just to see what he'd built. I was proud, even if I didn't always understand it. He spotted me near the entrance, clipboard in hand. He looked surprised, not unhappy, but not quite pleased either. The way someone looks when their worlds collide, the professional and the personal, and they can't decide which one deserves the spotlight. He approached with a polite smile. A curator stood beside him, waiting for an introduction. My son gave one. "This is Robert," he said. "He's retired now. Used to do restoration work, sort of. Sort of. Retired. Not my father. Not the man who taught me to notice light in a painting before color. Just Robert." The woman nodded and smiled vaguely, already bored, and I stood there nodding too, pretending not to notice how I'd been diminished into a footnote. He led me around the side, past a few lesser-known exhibits. I asked if we could see the main collection, the one that had made headlines last week. He hesitated, then with a half-laugh said, "Let's stay in this wing. The patrons are in the middle of a tour and, well, don't want to distract them." Distract, as if I were noise, a smudge on glass. I walked beside him in silence, not really hearing his commentary about textures and transitions. My mind was elsewhere, on the sketch in the basement, on Eliza's hands brushing dust off forgotten frames, on the years spent lifting Ethan onto my shoulders to see the world better. We passed by a modern sculpture, black wire twisted into what looked like an unraveling birdcage. A woman nearby said it represented emotional containment. I smiled faintly. The irony wasn't lost on me. We stood near a painting that reminded me of one Eliza once bought for $5 at a flea market. She said it looked like grief trying to sing. Ethan looked proud of this one. I could see it in his eyes, a real acquisition. Valuable, provocative, cold. He looked at his watch, asked if I wanted coffee from the cafe downstairs. I declined. I told him I'd head out, that I didn't want to keep him from his day. He offered a pat on the back, quick and distant, then turned to greet a group of donors with rehearsed warmth. I stepped outside. The cold air hit my lungs hard like truth. I walked a while, no direction, just the rhythm of old shoes against unfamiliar sidewalks. All those years of lifting, teaching, listening, and now I was just a quiet visitor, not even disruptive, simply invisible. Crowds never scared me, but erasure did. Not dramatic, not cruel, just quiet, polite, like being slowly painted over, layer by layer, until you were only a texture in the background. When I got home, I didn't turn on the lights. I went straight to the basement, sat on the old bench, looked at our wall of unknown names, silent faces, colors that had waited decades for someone to love them. I placed my hand on the frame closest to me. "I saw your cousins today," I murmured. "The ones who got accepted, who got framed and funded and lit up." The painting didn't answer, but it didn't have to. It still looked back. And that was enough. Because down here no one erased me. And I didn't have to be anyone else but the man who remembered. I don't know what moved me to pick up the phone that day. Maybe it was the way the sun had hit the corner of one of Eliza's favorite frames that morning. A forgotten watercolor of a girl kneeling near a stream, her reflection softly broken by the ripples. Maybe it was just loneliness disguised as hope. I remember standing in the basement, the receiver pressed to my ear, the cord coiled tightly in my palm like I was trying to hold on to something. I could hear his voice before he spoke. Smooth, confident, distracted. The tone of someone with too many meetings and not enough time for soft things. I told him I had a few pieces, some real gems. Early 20th century, pre-war, maybe earlier. I'd spent the past few days re-examining them, gently unwrapping decades-old paper, brushing off time like dust from an old wound. Some were unsigned. Some bore the mark of hands that had seen too much, felt too deeply, but each one breathed with a kind of quiet defiance. I thought maybe, just maybe, he'd be curious. I'd barely finished listing the artists and styles when he laughed. Not cruelly, but carelessly. A short, dismissive breath. "Dad," he said, "that sounds more like the kind of stuff a charity thrift might take. Honestly, I doubt we could make space for anything like that." I stood still, surrounded by the very things that had once made us feel rich. And in that moment, I felt poorer than I had in my entire life. Not because of the rejection, but because I'd offered him something sacred, something of Eliza, of us, and he had measured it against trends and ticket sales. I didn't argue. I thanked him for his time, said goodbye. And then I hung up the phone so gently, as if the silence that followed could still be bruised. That night, I went back downstairs and stared at the room that had once been our sanctuary. The colors, the weight of memory in every corner, the smell of old wood and canvas and time. And I locked the door, not to keep others out, but to keep myself from hoping. Because hope, I was learning, was heavier than grief. It made you reach out, speak up, offer. And nothing hurt quite like offering a piece of your soul and watching it fall unnoticed into silence. I poured a glass of water, sat by the window, watched the evening deepen into shadow. No one knocked. No one called. I suppose it's easier to forget a man who doesn't demand to be remembered. A man whose legacy lives in quiet corners and things too fragile to name. And somewhere inside, the part of me that used to collect beauty with open hands curled into a fist, not in anger, but in mourning. Winter had come and gone like a silent visitor, one who didn't knock, didn't stay for tea, but left everything a little colder. The house remained quiet. I move slower now, not out of age, but caution. You learn to step gently when your memories are louder than your days. It was early spring when Helen arrived. She'd been recommended by an old friend, one of the few who still called once in a while. A frame had cracked above the staircase, a simple one, nothing rare. I'd meant to fix it myself, but my hands weren't what they used to be. And besides, I wasn't sure I trusted them with anything beautiful anymore. Helen was young. Too young, I thought, to be in the business of preserving the past. She had ink on her hands and a quiet concentration that reminded me of Eliza in her schoolroom, bent over a child's drawing like it was sacred scripture. She said very little at first, just nodded politely, examined the damage, and started laying out her tools. As she worked, her eyes drifted to the hallway leading toward the basement. She tilted her head. "Storage room?" she asked, half casual. "Something like that," I said. My voice was hesitant, protective. That door hadn't been opened in months, not since the night I locked it and left my hope behind with the dust and canvas. But something about her made me pause. Maybe it was the way she touched the frame, with care, not calculation. Maybe it was the absence of pretense in her eyes. "Would you like to see something?" I heard myself ask before I even meant to. She smiled. "Always." The lock clicked open like an exhale. I turned on the dim bulb at the bottom of the stairs. It buzzed once, then glowed, casting soft light over the space that had once been the heart of our home. Helen stepped in slowly, eyes scanning the shelves, the stacks, the leaning frames. She moved like someone walking through a cathedral, quiet, attentive, reverent. And then she stopped. It was the soldier sketch, the one drawn on the back of the ration envelope, the same one Ethan had called crude. She stepped closer. Her fingers hovered near it, not touching. She didn't speak at first, just breathed. And then in a voice just above a whisper, "Do you even know what these are?" I turned toward her, surprised. "These aren't just pieces," she continued, her voice trembling with a kind of awe. "They're voices, entire lifetimes caught between brushstrokes." I watched her carefully, waited for the smile to break, for the casual laugh to follow, but none came. She turned slowly, looking at one, then another, a war widow drawn in graphite, a market scene in smudged pastel, a portrait of hands folded in prayer, unsigned but aching with sorrow. "These should be studied," she murmured, "preserved, exhibited." I sat down, suddenly tired in a way I hadn't felt before. Not worn, but released. Something inside me loosened, a knot tied so tightly over the years that I'd forgotten how much it hurt. She turned back to me. "Mr. Hart, may I come back? Not just for the frame, for this." For the first time in years, someone looked, not as a favor, not out of guilt, not because they felt they had to, but because something here, something born from dust and devotion, had reached out and touched them. I nodded slowly, and deep in that quiet basement, among forgotten art and buried belief, I felt it stir again. Hope? Not loud, not demanding, just present. She came back the next week, not alone. Helen arrived early, with sleeves rolled and eyes bright with something I hadn't seen in years. Reverence without nostalgia. Behind her followed 2 men and a woman, all of them carrying leather folders, foam gloves, magnifying lenses, and that same cautious silence people carry into ancient churches. They moved slowly, introducing themselves with soft voices. One was a provenance specialist from the university, another a museum archivist, the third an art historian with a focus on early 20th century realism. None of them asked how the collection came to be in my basement. No one smirked or questioned, how a retired bricklayer and a schoolteacher had come to own such things. They didn't need the story to believe it was real. They believed because the art spoke for itself. Helen began cataloging the pieces first. She handled each work like a rare bloom, placing them on velvet cloth, photographing, annotating. The others whispered in corners, flipping through reference books, pulling up registry numbers, holding the paintings to the light like they were looking for ghosts trapped beneath the strokes. They found things even Eliza and I never knew. One pastel still life, something she'd once bought for $20, turned out to be an early work by a French-Jewish artist who had died in a camp. His name had been lost in the war, but his brushwork matched a style only 3 surviving pieces had documented. And now there was a fourth. A portrait of a mother and son, unsigned, bore pigment that hadn't been used since the 1930s. A rare blend made only in a village that had burned to the ground. The signature, long faded, appeared under ultraviolet light. A woman known only by initials in a few scattered European archives. They whispered her name like a prayer. She had vanished during the resistance. Even the soldier sketch, the one Ethan had called crude, caused one of them to sit down, remove his glasses, and take a moment to breathe. "This," he said, voice shaking, "is the kind of piece that museums put behind glass. Not because it's perfect, but because it's true." I stood back most of the time, hands behind my back, watching, not interfering, just witnessing. For years I had come down here to remember, to grieve, to feel close to the woman I'd lost. I had dusted these pieces like they were tombstones, convinced they mattered only to me. But now strangers, educated, practiced, deliberate strangers, were kneeling before them as if they'd found the last surviving language of a forgotten people. They didn't speak of auctions. They didn't mention profit. They talked about preservation, restoration, public access. They talked about history. At one point, Helen turned to me with a gentle smile. "You know, this collection, it could rewrite some catalogs." I didn't know what to say, because in my mind, it was still just the work we'd collected over tea and long drives and soft laughter. It was still Eliza brushing her thumb over a corner and whispering, "This one's special." I had never thought to question her, never needed a certificate or plaque to believe her heart. But now the world was confirming what I had always quietly known. These weren't just beautiful, they were irreplaceable. And all those years of being told I had no taste, that our love for forgotten pieces was naive, unsophisticated, all of it melted like dust in sunlight. As they packed their notes, vowing to return the following week with scanning tools and archival materials, I sat back on the old wooden bench. The basement had never felt more alive. It no longer mourned, it glowed, because after years of silence, the voices trapped in canvas were finally being heard, and so was I. Words spread quietly at first, the kind of murmurs that start in academic circles, in closed-door meetings between curators and historians, who know the difference between imitation and truth. By the time the 5th appraiser had walked out of my basement, shaking their head in disbelief, the calls began to come. The first was from a collector in New York, someone with a penthouse gallery and a reputation for buying emotional pieces to hang next to stainless steel sculptures. He offered a price, then he doubled it, said words like exclusive rights, private vault protection, and discreet legacy acquisition. I thanked him for his interest, then declined, not because the number wasn't high, but because I could hear Eliza's voice, soft and certain, saying, "These were never meant to be locked away. It wasn't about the money. It never had been." One evening, after Helen had finished carefully sealing one of the oldest sketches in archival film, she sat beside me on the basement bench, the same one Eliza and I used to rest on after long days of cataloging dreams we didn't know we were building. I asked her quietly what she thought should happen next. She looked at the rows of pieces now labeled and protected, each one now glowing under proper lighting, and said, "These don't belong to collectors. They belong to people." And she was right. Not the elite, not the tastemakers, not those who would lock them behind keypads and humidity control systems, but the people who walk into galleries with wide eyes and aching hearts, hoping something will speak to them, not in prestige, but in recognition. So we wrote a letter. It had no grand introduction, no demands, just a list of works and a note that read, "We believe these deserve a home where the world can hear them." We signed it only with Eliza's maiden name, hers, not mine, because this had always been her vision, her eye, her tenderness. The reply from the National Gallery came in less than a week. A curator called personally. Her voice trembled as she thanked us, not for the donation, but for the trust. She said they had read every annotation Helen had written, every date, every origin theory, and the title we proposed for the exhibit, Voices in Silence, had left them in tears. It was all arranged with quiet efficiency. No press release, no handshakes, just care. Transport was scheduled. Each piece was handled like breath. Teams came with gloves and cases, whispering reverently as they moved from frame to frame. I stood back again, heart full and hollow, all at once, watching as the walls of my basement, once a sanctuary, once a tomb, were gently returned to the light. And then one day, they were gone. The basement felt strange afterward, clean, still sacred, but emptier, like a church after a wedding. I walked the space slowly, touching the shadows where each frame used to hang. I didn't cry, not because I wasn't moved, but because I was complete. Eliza would have stood at the top of the stairs that night, hands on her hips, eyes misty, and said, "We did good, didn't we?" And I would have said, "We did more than good. We remembered." In the weeks that followed, Helen and I worked closely with the curators. Final placements, lighting choices, wall text. I didn't want credit. I didn't want my name engraved. But I did want the truth to shine, the kind that lives in forgotten faces and trembling hands, in unschooled strokes, in unsigned genius. The exhibit was set to open in fall. A full wing, voices in silence, no celebrity names, no glass towers of interpretation, just art, left to speak in the language of longing and endurance. And though I never asked, I hoped, quietly, deeply, that someday someone might walk through those halls, pause before one of Eliza's favorite pieces and whisper, "I feel like I've known this all my life." 'Cause then they would have heard her too. The evening air hung heavy with anticipation, the kind you could feel in your chest, like a held breath before a final note. The National Gallery was bathed in warm light, its marble steps lined with people who spoke in low, important voices and wore suits like armor. Cameramen whispered to one another as they adjusted lenses. Program booklets fluttered like leaves in trembling hands. And at the center of it all stood the new wing, renamed simply for the exhibit, Voices in Silence. I arrived early, not as a guest of honor, but as a shadow in the room. No one recognized me, and I preferred it that way. My name wasn't on the banners. It wasn't in the speeches. I was just another man in an old coat, standing quietly in the crowd, the same way I used to stand in Eliza's classroom doorway as she read poetry to her students. Inside, the lights were dimmed just enough to let the pieces breathe. Every painting, every sketch, every fragile fragment of someone's forgotten brilliance was given space, reverence. The walls bore no loud commentary, only soft titles, modest descriptions, and in the corner of each, donated in memory of E. Marlowe. Her maiden name, her spirit. People moved slowly, some in silence, others whispering as though they had stumbled into something holy. I watched as a boy, no older than 10, stopped in front of a charcoal portrait of a woman holding a letter. He tugged at his mother's sleeve and said, "She looks like she's waiting for someone." The mother leaned in, nodded. They stood there for minutes, and then I saw him. Ethan. He arrived flanked by colleagues, critics, and 2 board members from his gallery. He walked like he always had in a room full of art. Confident, calculated, scanning with the eye of someone searching for flaws or brilliance, or both. He didn't notice me. I stayed behind a pillar near the side, heart still and guarded. He walked past a few installations with mild interest, but then he stopped, frozen, in front of one small piece, no larger than a sheet of paper, framed modestly, hung at child's eye level, a simple pencil sketch of a sleeping soldier, drawn on the back of a ration envelope, the one he had once handed back to me without a second glance, the one he had dismissed as crude. He read the description, twice. Untitled, artist unknown, believed to be wartime drawing, circa 1943. Donated in memory of E. Marlowe, currently considered a national cultural artifact of historical significance. I watched his eyes move from the text to the image, then back again, and then they didn't move at all. His colleagues began speaking, gesturing to other works, but he didn't follow. He just stood there still. I could see the way his jaw clenched. Not in anger, but in recognition. Something was unraveling. And in that moment, for the first time, he looked, truly looked, not at the value, not at the trend, but at the soul of the thing, the story beneath the pencil strokes, the hands behind the silence, and maybe, though I wouldn't dare hope too loud, he saw more than just a sketch. Maybe he saw a basement. A woman he called Mom, bent over books and frames, a man with calloused hands holding the past like it was sacred. Maybe he saw us. People began to gather near the piece, reading the small plaque. A critic murmured something about raw emotional tension. Another said it was a rare example of unfiltered wartime intimacy. Someone whispered that the whole exhibit felt like a quiet resurrection, but Ethan didn't speak. He didn't move, and I didn't need him to, because some moments don't need words. Some truths don't need to be explained. They just arrive, late, maybe, but whole. I stayed for another hour, watching people wander from piece to piece, some with tears, others with quiet smiles. Not one of them knew me. Not one of them knew what I had given. But they felt it, and that was enough. Outside, the city moved on, unaware of what had been remembered inside those gallery walls. But as I walked alone through the night, the air felt different. Not lighter, not louder, just full. Like Eliza's voice was in the wind, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel erased. I felt seen. The room was already quiet when Helen stepped onto the stage. Not the forced hush of etiquette, but the kind of stillness that comes when something sacred is about to be said. The lights dimmed slightly, framing her not like a speaker, but like a vessel, carrying something older, heavier, more enduring than her own name. She stood behind the podium in her simple dress, no jewelry, no theatrics, just her, and a silence that waited. Then she spoke, not with flourish or performance, but with a gentleness that demanded attention. She didn't list dates. She didn't boast about acquisitions or historic breakthroughs. She spoke of hands, of eyes, of rooms filled with quiet, of how the human spirit leaves traces in the smallest things. A brushstroke, a fold in paper, a tear in canvas carefully mended by someone who believed that art deserved a second chance, just like people do. She spoke of a woman who saw stories where others saw junk, a woman who gave unknown artists a home, who framed pain and wonder with equal reverence. And then she spoke of him, not by name, but by presence, a man who never wore a curator's badge, who never wrote essays or gave interviews. He didn't need to. He preserved art not with fame, but with care. Quiet, steady care. He didn't collect for admiration. He collected because some beauty is too sacred to leave behind. The air shifted. Some in the audience lowered their heads. Others raised their eyes. And somewhere near the fourth row, my son sat frozen. Helen continued, "This collection was never about prestige. It was about memory, about saying to the forgotten, you mattered, about giving them a wall, a light, and finally, a witness." Her voice broke slightly on that last word, not from nerves, from truth, and then she stepped back. There was a long pause, the kind that holds something holy between its seconds. Then someone stood, and then another. Applause erupted, not loud and frenzied, but deep, from the chest, from the place where real things live. But Ethan didn't stand. He sat in the same position, his eyes fixed somewhere far away, as if Helen's words had opened a door he wasn't ready to walk through. His fingers tightened on the edge of the chair, his mouth pressed shut, pale, still. I watched from the shadows, not with pride, not with vengeance, just a quiet ache. Because when the room stood for what he had dismissed, he finally realized what he'd tried so long to forget. Not just the paintings, but the people behind them. The woman who raised him to see beauty in chipped edges. The man who stayed in the basement brushing dust from frames like polishing old prayers. That applause was not for wealth, not for curation, but for remembrance. And for a moment, the man who thought sentiment was embarrassing sat inside a wave of it he couldn't escape. And maybe that was the beginning. Not of forgiveness, not yet, but of seeing. And that sometimes is where all healing begins. The final room was smaller than the others, not grand, not echoing with marble and applause. Its walls were painted a deep, calming gray, the lighting warmer, more intimate. It was the quiet coda to the exhibition's symphony, where silence wasn't just observed, but honored, where those who lingered the longest often came to rest, to feel. At the center of that final wall hung the last piece, a simple oil painting of two clasped hands, weathered, uneven, real, one larger, calloused, the other slender, fragile. Fingertips just brushing knuckles. There was no background, no scene, just touch, connection, love without language. Eliza found it decades ago. She'd wept when she first saw it, her hand unconsciously reaching for mine, as if echoing the very gesture on canvas. This, she whispered then, is what survival looks like when it chooses softness. We never learned who painted it. There was no signature, only a faded pencil note on the back that read, "Keep going." That night, the gallery chose to unveil it last. Not with a speech, not with music, just a simple act, removing the soft cloth that had covered the plaque beneath it. People gathered, hushed. A curator stepped forward and gently lifted the fabric. Gasps weren't audible, but something shifted. A ripple, an unseen wind through a still room. The plaque read, "Donated by Robert and Eliza Hart," in quiet defiance of erasure. My name. Our name? Together. Not hidden in footnotes or pseudonyms, not erased for the sake of modesty or pride, but written clearly, finally, gently. I stood in the far corner, back to the pillar, eyes not leaving Ethan. He had just entered the room, walking slower than before, alone now. His entourage dispersed somewhere between the wine tables and exit hall. His hands were in his pockets, his tie loosened slightly. He looked older in this light, and then he saw it. He stepped closer, read the plaque, and stopped. I saw his head tilt, just a little, the kind of motion the body makes when the heart suddenly starts unraveling what the mind has missed. He read it again, and again. Hart, not Marlowe, not anonymous. Hart, his mother's name, his name, my name. The realization hit like a wave collapsing against stone, silent, relentless. The color drained from his face as the meaning reached him. Not just that the donation had come from someone he knew, but that he had stood surrounded by legacy all night and never recognized the scent of home. A woman nearby murmured something to him, probably about the beauty of the piece, but he didn't respond. His shoulders sank slightly, not from shame alone, but from something deeper, the weight of unspoken memory, of moments not lived, of chances not taken, of love misunderstood. He reached out, fingertips brushing the edge of the plaque like he wasn't sure it was real. And in that trembling moment, I could see the boy he once was, the one who used to draw with Eliza on rainy afternoons, who once held my hand too tightly on the first day of school. Time had taken so much, but this moment gave something back. Not a reconciliation, not yet, but a name, ours, no longer hidden in a basement, no longer whispered behind closed doors, but carved into bronze beneath a painting of hands that never let go. The room stood still, and in that stillness I knew she would have smiled, and he finally saw us. The evening had thinned. The crowd had spilled out into the city like soft rain, their voices fading into footsteps on marble and cobblestone. Inside the gallery, the lights dimmed one room at a time. But I had already slipped away before the closing words. I didn't want to hear the echo of praise. Not tonight. Not for this. I sat by the old stone fountain behind the museum, the one tourists rarely found. It had no plaque, no story, just a slow trickle of water that caught the moonlight and turned it into something worth watching. My coat was buttoned up against the chill, my hands folded loosely in my lap. The applause from earlier still rang in my ears, not because it was loud, but because it had never been meant for me. And yet somehow it had reached me anyway. I heard the footsteps before I saw him. They were uneven, hesitant, like someone walking across a floor that might crack beneath them. Ethan. He stood there, just beyond the circle of the fountain's glow, hands clenched, unsure whether to sit or run or scream. His eyes were glassy, his voice a thread barely holding weight. "Why didn't you tell me?" He didn't say hello. He didn't try to laugh it off or pretend it didn't matter. "For once?" he asked plainly. I didn't look at him right away. I watched the water curve around the stone lip of the fountain, endlessly moving, never breaking. And when I did look at him, I saw something unfamiliar. Not arrogance, not pride, but a man who had finally seen what he spent years refusing to look at. I could have said 1,000 things. I could have told him about the years in that basement, about Eliza's hands brushing against old paper, about the nights I stood just outside his gallery, wondering if he'd ever see beyond his own reflection. But I didn't. I said only what needed to be said. You already decided I had nothing to offer. That was the wound, clean, uncovered. He blinked, like the words had knocked the wind from him. His lips parted, then closed. He stammered, searching for a defense that didn't exist, for an apology that wouldn't sound too late. But there was no clever way to rewrite time. So he stood there. And for once, finally, felt what I had felt for so long. The silence, the erasure, the absence that isn't loud but lives in every room where your presence is politely ignored. I let the silence stretch, because it was his turn to sit with it. He looked at the ground, then the sky. Anywhere but my face. And still, I waited. I wasn't angry. I wasn't cruel. I was just done carrying the weight of being unseen. Let him feel it now, not as punishment, but as understanding. He sat beside me eventually, not close, not far, enough to hear the fountain, enough to hear my breath. He didn't speak again, and I didn't fill the silence for him. We just sat, father and son, finally on the same bench, with nothing left to prove, and everything finally exposed. It arrived on a Tuesday. No return address, no signature on the box, just my name, written in his handwriting. Still clean, still exact, as if every letter had been measured with care. I held it for a while before opening it, unsure of what it would hold. A gesture, perhaps? Or another attempt at distance disguised as diplomacy? But inside was something else entirely. Wrapped in protective paper was one of Ethan's own curated books, the limited edition catalog from his last major exhibit. Hardbound, museum quality. I'd never owned a copy. I'd never asked. I wasn't sure he ever thought I'd want one. But this wasn't a gift for praise. Tucked inside the front cover, carefully taped beneath the flap, was a handwritten note. Just one line. I still have a lot to learn, but maybe I could start by listening. No apology, no grand explanation. And somehow that made it honest. I held the book in my lap, running my fingers along the embossed cover, then over the note. My heart didn't race. My eyes didn't tear. It was quieter than that. Deeper. Because this wasn't about reconciliation in the way most people picture it. No tearful hugs, no dramatic music, just space. Space where there had once been a wall. I turned the pages slowly. His choices were bold, sleek, sharp, curated for impact. The work of a man who knew how to command attention, but somewhere between the lines I sensed a shift, a thread of vulnerability beginning to weave its way in. Toward the middle of the book, I paused. There, without fanfare, was a new edition, a small piece, tucked beside a much larger, more contemporary work. The caption read, "Untitled, unknown artist, found, preserved." I recognized it immediately. One of ours. Not from the exhibition. Not one the world had seen. One that had never left the basement. A watercolor Eliza adored, a quiet street at dawn, brushstrokes still wet with sleep. She used to say it reminded her of the mornings before the world started asking for too much. He had chosen it, not for status, not for name, but for feeling, for memory, and placed it among giants as if to say, "This too matters." I closed the book gently, set it down on the table beside me, and sat back in my chair. Not in triumph, but in closure. Not because he had finally seen me, but because he had finally allowed himself to see through her eyes. That was enough. Not everything would be repaired. Some cracks are meant to remain visible, like the lines in an old painting, reminders of time and pressure and endurance. But something had shifted, not loud, not certain, but real. And in that quiet afternoon, sunlight pouring gently across the floor, I whispered only 3 words. Not to him, not even out loud, but to the space between us. She'd be proud. I go on quiet days. When the gallery is still, when the air is soft and the light hangs low against the glass, when the only sound is the hush of footsteps and the occasional murmur of wonder. They don't know who I am, the visitors, the docents, the school groups wandering through the voices and silence wing with their wide eyes and open notebooks. To them, I'm just an old man with steady shoes and a calm expression, walking the same path I once carved out with a woman who saw the world in brushstrokes. And I like it that way. It's better somehow to stand among the living echoes of forgotten names and simply witness, not as their owner, not as their savior, but as their friend, their guardian, their listener. Children walk past the frames and ask questions, not about value, not about style, but about the people. "Who painted this?" one asks. "Why are their names missing?" And I watch the guide kneel beside them, smile, and say softly, "Some voices weren't allowed to be loud, but they mattered, and someone made sure we'd still hear them. Sometimes they mention us, not with fanfare, not like heroes, just in passing. The Harts, Robert and Eliza, they collected these with care, not with a price tag. They saved what the world tried to forget. And in those moments I see him, my son, standing near the back, hands folded in front of him, watching. He doesn't speak. He doesn't interrupt. He doesn't correct them when they speak of us with reverence. Because now he understands. He sees that the greatest legacy is not carved in stone or printed in gold. It's in the eyes of a child staring too long at a painting because something in it feels like home. It's in the breath someone holds when they realize they're standing in front of a story that was almost lost. Sometimes I catch him standing before the soldier sketch, the one he once dismissed as childish. He lingers there now, not just looking, listening. He told me once quietly over coffee that neither of us drank, that he brings new interns here at the start of their training, not to show off, not to impress, but to remind them. Taste, he said, isn't about trends. It's about memory. It's about feeling. It's about what you carry and what you refuse to let die. I didn't answer. I didn't need to, because the truth had already answered for us. In every frame, in every stroke, in every quiet voice that now had a room of its own. Eliza would have cried here, not out of sadness, but out of fullness, out of that quiet kind of joy that doesn't scream, only glows. I walk through the rooms slowly. Sometimes I stop and sit on the bench in the final gallery, the one beneath the painting of clasped hands. The plaque still shines, donated by Robert and Eliza Hart, in quiet defiance of erasure. People read it. They pause. Some touch the edge. And though no one turns to thank me, I feel it, in the breath they hold, in the reverence they carry forward. This place remembers, not because it had to, but because someone chose to, and maybe that's what love really is. Not what you collect, not what you claim, but what you keep alive.